Widow expelled by her children finds a chest in the barn, the secrets inside changed her life forever. Estella woke up every day before sunrise. Her movements were precise but lacked enthusiasm, as if driven by an external force that kept her standing despite the weight of her solitude. Her simple room, located behind a small stable, mirrored her life, practical, devoid of adornments, but still functional. The only decoration was a worn crucifix hanging on the wall, a reminder of a faith that struggled to survive amid adversity. On the horizon, the first rays of light painted the fields gold, but the beauty of the scene went unnoticed by most. For Estella, however, this brief spectacle was a silent comfort. Sitting on a makeshift bench near the stable, she watched the sun rise as she prepared for another day. There was no one waiting for her, no one to share those luminous mornings with. Her children, who once filled her home with laughter and chaos, now didn't even mention her. "You never did anything for us." The words of her eldest son echoed like knives in her memory. Estella knew there had been mistakes in the past, but she often wondered if she truly deserved the contempt they showed her. Since her husband had passed away, the distance between her and her children seemed to have grown irreparably. Now, she lived there, invisible to the world, trying not to disappear completely. At the stable, the horses were her only source of comfort. Havana, a white mare with deep, gentle eyes, had a special connection with Estella. Whenever she saw her, Havana would approach slowly, as if sensing the woman's sadness and wanting to offer an invisible shoulder for her to lean on. Estella whispered softly as she stroked the animal's neck. "You understand me, don't you, girl? Only the two of us know what it's like to be left behind." Havana lightly nodded her head, and Estella allowed herself a small but genuine smile. Those daily moments with Havana were her refuge, a brief reminder that there was still kindness in the world, even if it came from an animal. The work in the stable was hard, but Estella performed each task with dedication. She cleaned the dirt floor, organized supplies, and fed the horses. Lupita, the young stable owner, was a determined woman, always in a hurry. That morning, she entered wearing her leather boots that echoed on the floor, without even glancing at Estella. Though used to Lupita's indifference, Estella couldn't help but feel a pang of hurt. For years, she had felt like a shadow, invisible to those around her. While feeding Havana, she whispered once more, almost as if praying, "Why, God? What did I do to be forgotten like this?" At the end of the day, the usual ritual repeated itself. Estella returned to her simple room, sat on the iron bed, and stared at the crucifix. The silence was almost deafening, but this time something felt different. A vague sensation lingered, a feeling that her story wasn't over. As she ran her fingers over the small metal around her neck, she whispered to herself, "There's still something coming, I can feel it." The mare neighed softly in the stable next door, as if agreeing with her. That night, Estella lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room. Her heart felt heavy, as it often did, but her mind was restless. The faint sound of the horses shifting in the stable nearby usually comforted her, yet tonight it only deepened her loneliness. Seeking solace, she rose from her bed and decided to take a walk through the stable. The cool night air brushed her face as she stepped outside, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground. As she moved through the rows of stalls, she found herself drawn to a corner she rarely visited. This section was cluttered with old tools, unused equipment, and forgotten debris. She reached out to steady herself against a rickety shelf, but her hand brushed against something unexpected. It was a small, dust-covered frame hidden behind a stack of wooden planks. She pulled it out and wiped the glass with the sleeve of her blouse. Beneath the layer of grime was an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, its colors faded but still vibrant enough to evoke a sense of reverence. For a moment, Estella simply stared at the image. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Why are you here? Have you been forgotten, too?" Something inside her shifted. She didn't know if it was the quiet of the night, the soft glow of the moon, or the image in her hands, but a deep sense of peace began to fill her chest. Tears streamed down her face, not of sadness, but of relief, as though she had been waiting for this moment without realizing it. Holding the image close, Estella sat on a hay bale near Havana's stall. The mare whinnied softly, sticking her head out to nuzzle Estella's arm. Estella chuckled through her tears, stroking Havana's mane. "You're right, girl," she said quietly. "I needed this." The image of the Virgin felt like a message, though Estella couldn't yet understand its meaning. She carefully placed it on a nearby ledge, deciding she would clean and restore the frame in the morning. As she made her way back to her room, she glanced over her shoulder at the stable. A faint light seemed to emanate from the corner where she had found the image, though she dismissed it as her imagination. That night, for the first time in years, Estella slept deeply. The following day, her steps felt lighter. As she worked, she kept glancing at the image, now cleaned and placed prominently on a shelf in the stable. The horses seemed calmer, too, as if they shared in her newfound serenity. Even Lupita noticed the change. "You seem different today," Lupita said, her tone cautious. Estella looked up from the bucket she was scrubbing and offered a small smile. "Maybe I am." Lupita tilted her head, studying the older woman. "Did something happen?" "Perhaps," Estella replied, her voice cryptic but kind. "Let's just say I've found a bit of hope where I wasn't expecting it." Lupita didn't press further, but her curiosity was evident. She walked away, shaking her head, and muttered under her breath, "Hope doesn't pay the bills." Later that afternoon, as Estella finished sweeping near the stable entrance, Havana began pacing restlessly in her stall. Estella rushed over, sensing the mare's distress. Havana pawed at the ground, her movements deliberate, as if trying to draw Estella's attention to something. "What is it, girl?" Estella asked, her voice tinged with worry. She opened the stall door and noticed a strange patch of dirt that Havana had been kicking. It seemed looser than the surrounding ground. Grabbing a small shovel, Estella began digging. She didn't know what she was looking for, but her heart raced with anticipation. After a few minutes, the blade of the shovel struck something solid. Kneeling down, Estella brushed away the dirt with her hands until a small, weathered box came into view. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. The box was secured with a rusted latch, which broke easily under her touch. Inside, she found a bundle of aged, yellowing papers tied with a faded red ribbon. Her breath caught as she gently untied the ribbon and unfolded the first sheet. The handwriting was familiar. It was her father's. Estella's hands trembled as she held the fragile letters. The familiar loops and swirls of her father's handwriting seemed to leap off the page, as though he were speaking to her from beyond the grave. Her chest tightened with a mix of emotion, grief, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of dread. She took a deep breath, unfolded the first letter carefully, and began to read. "My dearest Mariana." Estella froze. The name wasn't familiar. She read on. "I've made promises to you that I fear I cannot keep. The weight of my obligations pulls me away, though my heart remains yours. This land we spoke of, our land, holds a piece of my soul, and though it may be lost to us now, I pray that one day it will be found and restored." The letter ended abruptly, as though her father had run out of time to finish. Estella frowned, flipping the paper over, but the back was blank. Her mind raced. Mariana? Who was she? And what land was her father writing about? She opened another letter, her curiosity growing. "Mariana, my love." This one was longer, filled with intimate details about a love her father had clearly kept secret. He wrote about late-night meetings under the stars, whispered promises of a future together, and a piece of land that he called their sanctuary. Estella's heart ached as she read, feeling like she was intruding on something sacred. By the third letter, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. "Forgive me, Mariana. My family's expectations have forced my hand. I've been forbidden from seeing you again, and I fear the land we dreamed of will be lost forever. If, by some miracle, these letters find you, know that my love for you has never wavered. Tears blurred Estella's vision. She set the letters down carefully and leaned back against Havana's stall, her mind spinning. This Mariana, whoever she was, had meant everything to her father. But why had he never mentioned her? And what land was he talking about? She sat there for a long time, staring at the open box. Something inside her told her that this discovery wasn't just about the past. It was about her future too. That evening, after the work in the stable was done, Estella brought the box to her room. She spread the letters out on her small table, studying them for clues. Her father had written about the land as if it were a treasure, something precious that he had lost but hoped would one day be found. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had lived on this land for years, working at the stable, never imagining it might hold secrets from her own family's past. The next morning, she approached Lupita cautiously. The younger woman was busy inspecting a shipment of feed, her expression tense as usual. "Lupita," Estella said softly, clutching one of the letters in her hand. Lupita glanced up, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I'm kind of busy. I need to talk to you. It's important." With a sigh, Lupita waved her over to the side, where they could speak privately. "What's going on?" Estella hesitated, then held up the letter. "I found this. It was buried in Havana's stall." Lupita frowned, taking the paper from her hands. She scanned the words quickly, her eyes narrowing. "Who's Mariana? And what's this about land?" "I don't know," Estella admitted. "But these letters were written by my father. He mentioned a piece of land, something he called a sanctuary. I think he was talking about this place." Lupita looked skeptical. "This place?" "Estella, this is just a stable. There's nothing special about it." "Maybe not now," Estella said, her voice firm. "But there's something here. Something he wanted to preserve." Lupita crossed her arms. "Look, I don't have time for wild theories. If you want to dig around in your father's past, go ahead. But don't expect me to help." Estella's heart sank, but she refused to give up. That night, she returned to the stable with a lantern and the letters in hand. As she reread her father's words, a phrase caught her attention. "Beneath the shadow of the great oak, our sanctuary awaits." Her eyes widened. The great oak. She knew the tree he was referring to. It was the oldest tree on the property, standing tall near the edge of the field. She had passed it countless times without giving it a second thought. Determined, Estella set out across the dark field, the lantern casting flickering light on the path ahead. When she reached the oak, she knelt beneath its sprawling branches and began to dig. Minutes turned into hours, and just as her energy began to wane, her hand struck something solid. She brushed away the dirt and uncovered a metal box, its surface rusted with age. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside were more letters, along with a faded map. The map detailed the layout of the property, but there were markings she didn't recognize, symbols and paths that seemed to lead to hidden areas. Estella sat back, clutching the map to her chest. Her father's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't just a stable. This land held a story she was meant to uncover. Estella sat beneath the great oak tree, clutching the map and the additional letters she had uncovered. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows on the weathered map as her fingers traced the faded lines and markings. There were pathways drawn that she didn't recognize, areas labeled in her father's meticulous handwriting: El Santuario, El Corazón Perdido, La Entrada Escondida. The words filled her with equal parts excitement and apprehension. Returning to her small room, Estella spread the map across her table. She compared it to her own mental image of the stable and surrounding fields. One thing was clear: the land she had lived and worked on for years held far more than she had ever imagined. The following morning, she approached Lupita again, this time with the map in hand. Lupita, I need you to look at this, Estella said, her voice steady but urgent. Lupita, still annoyed by the previous day's conversation, gave her a skeptical glance. Is this another one of your discoveries, Estella? I don't have time for fantasies. This isn't a fantasy, Estella replied firmly, spreading the map out on a nearby bale of hay. It's a map of this property. Look at the markings. These paths lead to places we've never explored. Lupita leaned over reluctantly, her eyes scanning the map. As much as she wanted to dismiss it, she couldn't deny the detail and precision of the drawings. And you think this is, what? Some kind of treasure map? I think it's a part of my family's story, Estella said. But it could also be a part of yours. Your family owns this land now, but its history is tied to mine. Don't you want to know what's out there? Lupita sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Fine. I'll help you look. But if this turns out to be nothing, you owe me a week of free labor. Estella smiled faintly. Deal. Later that afternoon, the two women set out with shovels, ropes, and a notebook to document their findings. Lupita brought along her phone for photos, though she kept muttering that they were wasting their time. Estella carried the map, leading the way to the first marked location, El Corazón Perdido. The path was overgrown with weeds and brambles, but Estella moved with a determination that surprised Lupita. When they reached the spot, Estella stopped abruptly. Before them was a crumbled stone wall, almost completely swallowed by the earth. What is this? Lupita asked, brushing away vines that clung to the rocks. It looks like part of an old building, Estella said. She knelt and examined the stones. Maybe a foundation for a house or a storage area. As they cleared away more of the debris, they uncovered a small, rusted plaque embedded in one of the stones. The words were faint, but with some effort, they deciphered the inscription. En memoria de nuestro amor eterno. In memory of our eternal love. Estella's breath caught. This must have been part of the sanctuary my father wrote about, she said softly. Lupita frowned. But why would he call it that? Was this a place for your family? It wasn't for my family, Estella said, her voice thick with emotion. It was for her. For Mariana. The discovery deepened the mystery, and Estella could feel the weight of her father's past pressing on her. But the map pointed to another spot, labeled La Entrada Escondida. Let's keep going, Estella said, her determination unwavering. The second location was farther into the property, near the edge of the woods that bordered the stable's fields. When they arrived, they found what appeared to be an old well, its stone rim cracked but intact. This has been here for decades, Lupita said, peering down into the darkness. But I've never given it much thought. It's just an old well. Estella studied the map again. It's more than that. Look, this symbol here matches the one on the map. There's something hidden down there. Lupita rolled her eyes. You want to climb into an abandoned well based on a scribble on a map? Estella didn't hesitate. If it means uncovering the truth, yes. Using the rope they had brought, Estella secured herself and began to descend into the well. The walls were damp, and the air grew colder the farther down she went. At first, all she could see was darkness, but then her lantern illuminated something unusual. The bottom of the well wasn't filled with water. Instead, it was covered in a layer of old stones, arranged in a deliberate pattern. In the center of the stones was a small, rusted chest. Estella's heart pounded as she opened the chest. Inside, she found a bundle of papers, a few small trinkets, and a key. The papers were faded but legible, and she recognized her father's handwriting immediately. For whoever finds this, know that this land holds more than its surface reveals. Protect it. Cherish it. And, above all, honor the promises made here. Estella's hands trembled as she read the words. This wasn't just a hidden treasure, it was a legacy. A story that connected her father's love, his sacrifices, and the land she now stood on. When she climbed back out of the well and showed the chest to Lupita, the younger woman finally seemed to take the discovery seriously. "Estella," Lupita said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "maybe you're right. Maybe this place really does have a story we need to uncover." Estella nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We're just getting started." That evening, Estella and Lupita carried the rusted chest and its contents back to the stable. The weight of what they had discovered filled the air between them, replacing Lupita's earlier skepticism with an unspoken curiosity. They sat at the small wooden table in Estella's room, the lantern casting a warm glow over the papers and trinkets laid out before them. Among the items in the chest, the key stood out the most. It was heavy and ornate, with intricate carvings along its handle that resembled vines entwined with tiny flowers. Estella turned it over in her hand, studying every detail. "What do you think it unlocks?" Lupita asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Estella replied, her voice steady. "But it must be important. My father wouldn't have hidden it otherwise." The papers included a series of handwritten notes and what appeared to be a detailed inventory of items, a bronze statue, an embroidered shawl, a gold pendant. Most of the objects listed were unfamiliar to Estella, but one note in particular caught her eye. "The passage is sealed, but the key will reveal the truth. The sanctuary lies beyond." "The sanctuary," Estella murmured. He mentioned it again. This must be what he was trying to protect. Lupita tapped the note with her finger. "What passage? Is there another location on the map that we haven't checked yet?" Estella spread the map out once more. Her eyes scanned the faded lines until they landed on a small marking near the southern edge of the property, labeled El Refugio. She traced the path with her finger. "Here. This must be it." "It's on the far end of the property," Lupita said. "We've never used that area, it's mostly overgrown now." "Then that's where we're going," Estella said firmly. The next morning, armed with shovels, machetes to cut through the brush, and the mysterious key, they set out for El Refugio. The walk was long and arduous, the terrain rough and uneven. Thorny vines and thick undergrowth blocked their path, but Estella moved forward with relentless determination. When they finally reached the marked spot, they found an overgrown clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone archway, half buried by the surrounding earth. The structure seemed ancient, its weathered stones covered in moss and ivy. "This must be it," Estella said, her voice trembling with anticipation. Lupita walked around the archway, her hands brushing against the stone. "It looks like some kind of entrance, but there's no door." Estella knelt near the base of the arch, where the dirt was loose and uneven. She began to dig with her hands, and soon uncovered a small iron plate embedded in the ground. The plate had a keyhole in its center, surrounded by carvings similar to the ones on the key. Without hesitation, Estella inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it, and with a groan of rusted metal, the plate shifted slightly. The ground beneath them trembled, and a low rumbling noise echoed through the clearing. Lupita stumbled back, her eyes wide. "What did you just do?" Before Estella could answer, a section of the ground near the archway began to sink, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. The air that wafted up was cool and damp, carrying with it the scent of earth and stone. "This is it," Estella whispered. "This is the passage my father wrote about." Lupita hesitated, glancing between the passage and Estella. "You really want to go down there? We don't even know what's inside." "I have to," Estella said, her voice resolute. "He left this for me to find. I can't turn back now." With the lantern in hand, Estella descended into the passage, her steps careful but unwavering. Lupita followed reluctantly, muttering about how she couldn't let the older woman go alone. The narrow stone corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the air growing colder with each step. Strange carvings adorned the walls, symbols and shapes that neither of them could recognize. Finally, the passage opened into a small underground chamber. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal, and atop it rested a bronze statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The statue was surrounded by a circle of lit candles, their flames impossibly steady despite the lack of wind. Lupita gasped. How are the candles lit? This place has been sealed for decades. Estella stepped forward, her heart pounding. She reached out to touch the statue, but her hand froze just before making contact. There was something sacred about the space, something that demanded reverence. Around the base of the pedestal were more objects from the inventory list, the embroidered shawl, the gold pendant, and other treasures. Each item seemed to tell a story, a fragment of the past left behind to be uncovered. Estella's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, this was his sanctuary. This was what he wanted to protect. Lupita looked around the chamber, her expression a mix of awe and confusion. Why? What was so important about this place? Estella turned to her, holding the pendant in her hand. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about love, about faith, about preserving something that mattered. He knew this would be lost if no one fought to keep it alive. The two women stood in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Estella felt a deep sense of connection, not only to her father but to the land itself. This was more than a legacy. It was a purpose. As they prepared to leave, Estella looked back at the chamber one last time. The statue seemed to glow softly in the lantern light, as if blessing her for completing the journey her father had started so many years ago. The climb out of the passage felt heavier than the descent. Estella and Lupita carried the weight of their discovery, not just in the physical sense, with the pendant, letters, and map tucked safely into Estella's satchel, but emotionally, as if they had unearthed a part of themselves along with the hidden sanctuary. Back in the clearing, the sunlight felt harsher, almost invasive after the stillness of the underground chamber. Estella shielded her eyes and turned to look at the ancient archway once more. She couldn't help but feel that the sanctuary had been watching over them the entire time. Lupita broke the silence, her voice still tinged with disbelief. So, what now? What do we do with this? Estella hesitated, her fingers brushing the pendant in her satchel. The cool metal seemed to hum with energy, as though urging her to continue. We don't do anything yet, she said finally. We need to understand what we found before deciding its future. Lupita nodded, though she seemed unconvinced. If people find out about this, they'll come. Treasure hunters, developers, this land will be torn apart. That's exactly why we can't rush, Estella replied. My father didn't hide this to see it destroyed. He wanted it preserved, honored. They began the long walk back to the stable, the map and their thoughts guiding their steps. As they reached the familiar site of the wooden structure, Havana let out a soft whinny from her stall, as if sensing their return. Estella smiled faintly, patting the mare's nose as she passed. Back in her small room, Estella carefully laid out the objects they had retrieved. The pendant gleamed in the soft light, its design intricate and beautiful, a golden heart surrounded by delicate rays, almost like the sun. She reached for the letters and began to read them again, this time searching for meaning in the words she had initially overlooked. Her father's messages spoke of love, loss, and redemption, but there was a recurring theme of trust, trust in the land, trust in the people who cared for it, and trust in the faith that bound them all together. Lupita entered the room and leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. I've been thinking, she said. If your father went through all this trouble to hide the sanctuary, he must have been afraid of someone finding it. Someone who would have used it for the wrong reasons. Estella nodded slowly. That's possible. He might have wanted to keep it safe from people who saw it as nothing more than treasure. Then maybe we should do the same, Lupita said. Keep it hidden. Estella looked up at her, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Hiding it is what kept it safe all these years, but it also buried the truth. The sanctuary isn't just a place. It's a story. And stories deserve to be told. Lupita frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she walked over to the pendant and picked it up. "This feels important," she said, turning it over in her hands. "It's not just a decoration. Maybe it's a clue or a symbol of something bigger." Estella reached out and took the pendant gently from Lupita's hands. "It's a piece of my father's heart," she said softly. "And now, it's part of ours." That evening, Estella sat by the stable, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. Lupita joined her, bringing 2 steaming mugs of coffee. They sipped in silence, the tension between them softened by the shared weight of their discovery. "You know," Lupita began, her voice hesitant, "I've always seen this place as just a business. A way to survive. But now, it feels different. Like it's alive." "It is," Estella said. "This land has always been alive. We just needed to listen." For the first time in years, Estella felt a sense of peace. The sanctuary was no longer just her father's secret, it was a part of her journey now, a chance to rebuild not only her own life but perhaps something larger. As the stars began to emerge, Estella whispered a quiet prayer, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The sanctuary had been found, but its story was just beginning. The next morning, Estella awoke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The dawn filtered through the thin curtains of her small room, painting the space in soft amber tones. She sat at her table, the map and pendant before her, and began to sketch her thoughts into a notebook. Every detail of the sanctuary, every word from her father's letters, felt like pieces of a puzzle she was meant to solve. Lupita found her there, a cup of coffee in her hand, her expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and curiosity. "You've been up for a while, haven't you?" Estella looked up and smiled faintly. "I couldn't sleep. There's so much to figure out, so much to protect." Lupita sat down across from her, glancing at the notebook filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the sanctuary. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said last night. About this land being alive." She paused, swirling her coffee. "Maybe it's more than just alive. Maybe it's waiting, for us to do something." Estella tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Lupita leaned forward, her voice steady. "We can't just keep this a secret forever. But if we're going to share it, we need to control the narrative. We need to decide how it's revealed, who we can trust to help us protect it." Estella nodded slowly, feeling a mix of pride and relief at Lupita's words. "You're right. This isn't just about me or my father anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been connected to this land, and everyone who could benefit from its story." They decided to start small, reaching out to a trusted historian in the nearby town, someone who had previously worked with Lupita on a community project to preserve the local chapel. His name was Javier, a reserved but passionate man in his early 40s, known for his meticulous research and deep respect for history. Later that day, Lupita made the call. Javier arrived at the stable that afternoon, his expression curious but cautious. He was tall and lean, his dark eyes sharp and probing as he surveyed the surroundings. "So," he said, stepping out of his old pickup truck and adjusting the strap of his satchel, "you said you had something important to show me. What is it?" Lupita gestured toward Estella, who stood by the stable entrance with the map clutched in her hands. "This is Estella. She's the one who made the discovery." Javier extended his hand, and Estella shook it, her grip firm despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know it sounds unbelievable, but I need someone who can help us understand what we've found." Javier gave a small nod, his curiosity clearly piqued. "I'm listening." Estella led him to her room, where the map, letters, and pendant were spread out on the table. As Javier examined each item, his expression shifted from skepticism to awe. He picked up the pendant, running his fingers over its intricate design. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. This craftsmanship, it's not just decorative. It's symbolic. The heart, the rays, it's tied to themes of divine love and protection. It's deeply rooted in religious and cultural traditions. Estella nodded, her throat tight. It belonged to my father. He left it for me to find. Javier looked up at her, his expression softening. This pendant, the map, the sanctuary, it all tells a story. A story that needs to be preserved and shared. But you're right to be cautious. Something this significant could attract the wrong kind of attention. That's what we're afraid of, Lupita said. But we can't just hide it forever. Javier sat back, his mind clearly racing. We'll need to document everything, photographs, detailed descriptions, even 3D models of the sanctuary if possible. But more importantly, we need a plan to protect the site. There are grants and legal protections we can apply for to designate the area as a cultural landmark. Estella's eyes widened. You really think that's possible? Javier smiled faintly. It's not just possible. It's necessary. What you found isn't just a family secret, it's a piece of history. The three of them spent the rest of the afternoon planning their next steps. Javier took photographs of the map and pendant, promising to start researching immediately. Lupita began making a list of potential allies in the community, people who might support their efforts to preserve the land. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Estella found herself standing by the stable once again, watching the sky shift from orange to deep indigo. She clutched the pendant tightly in her hand, its weight grounding her in the present while tethering her to the past. For years, she had felt invisible, forgotten by the people she loved most. But now, standing on the very land her father had fought to protect, she felt a spark of purpose reignite within her. Papa, she whispered, her voice steady but laced with emotion, I won't let your story fade. I promise. Behind her, Havana let out a soft, reassuring whinny, as if to echo her resolve. The days that followed were a blur of activity for Estella, Lupita, and Javier. The map and pendant became the centerpieces of their work, guiding their exploration and research. Javier pored over historical records and archives in the nearby town, seeking connections between the sanctuary and the region's past. Lupita worked tirelessly to maintain the stable while discreetly gathering support from trusted community members. Estella, however, found herself drawn back to the sanctuary. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were still secrets hidden within its stone walls. One afternoon, she stood beneath the ancient oak tree, the pendant hanging from a leather cord around her neck. The air felt different here, heavier, almost sacred. She placed her hand on the archway, feeling the cool, rough texture of the stone. What else are you hiding? She murmured. Her question was met with silence, but as she stepped back, her foot caught on something hard. Looking down, she noticed a small, half-buried stone with carvings that matched the ones on the pendant. Kneeling, she brushed away the dirt, revealing what appeared to be an engraving, a circle with rays extending outward, similar to a sunburst. Estella's breath caught. Javier needs to see this, she whispered. When she returned to the stable, Javier was already there, seated at the table with a stack of books and documents. His expression was one of intense focus, but it softened when he saw her. I think I found something, Estella said, setting the pendant on the table. Javier leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as she described the carving beneath the oak tree. That symbol, he said, tracing the design on the pendant with his finger, isn't just decorative. It's part of a larger motif tied to protection and enlightenment. It's often found in places of deep spiritual significance. Lupita entered the room, wiping her hands on her jeans. What does that mean? Are we talking about some kind of sacred site? Javier nodded slowly. It's possible. Sites like this were often used for rituals, gatherings, or as places of refuge. They weren't just physical spaces, they were symbolic, meant to connect people to something greater than themselves. Estella felt a chill run down her spine. So my father wasn't just hiding a sanctuary. He was protecting something sacred. Javier's expression grew serious. If that's the case, we need to be even more careful. Places like this have a way of attracting people who see them as opportunities for exploitation. Lupita folded her arms. Then we need to act fast. The last thing we need is someone finding out about this before we're ready. Over the next few days, Estella, Javier, and Lupita worked together to document the site thoroughly. They returned to the sanctuary with cameras and notebooks, capturing every detail. The carvings on the walls, the arrangement of the objects around the pedestal, even the way the light filtered into the chamber, all of it was carefully recorded. One evening, as they sat reviewing their findings, Javier placed a small stack of papers on the table. "I found something in the archives," he said. "There's a record of a land dispute from the late 1800s involving a family named Mendoza." Estella's heart skipped a beat. "That's my father's family name." Javier nodded. According to these records, the Mendozas were caretakers of this land for generations. They weren't the official owners, but they treated it as if it were their own. The sanctuary was mentioned in passing, described as a sacred space that the family vowed to protect. Lupita frowned. But if they didn't own the land, what happened to it? "That's the strange part," Javier said. The records stop abruptly. There's no mention of who took over the land or why the Mendozas left. It's like they disappeared. Estella stared at the papers, her mind racing. Her father's letters suddenly took on a new weight. His cryptic words about trust, protection, and loss weren't just personal, they were tied to a much larger history. "We need to keep digging," Estella said, her voice firm. "If the Mendozas were caretakers, then my father's actions make sense. He wasn't just hiding the sanctuary, he was fulfilling a promise." That night, as Estella prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. She ran her fingers over the pendant, its surface cool and smooth against her skin. "Papa," she whispered, gazing out the window at the darkened fields, "I'll protect it. Just like you wanted." The wind outside seemed to answer, rustling the trees in a soft, almost reassuring whisper. The following morning, Estella awoke to a strange sense of urgency. The pendant, which she now wore around her neck daily, felt heavier than usual, as though it were pulling her towards something she had yet to uncover. Outside, the stable was quiet except for the gentle sounds of the horses stirring. Lupita was already up, carrying buckets of water to refill the troughs. She glanced at Estella as she approached. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "I couldn't stop thinking about what Javier found," Estella admitted. "The Mendoza family, our role as caretakers. It feels like there's more to the story that we're missing." Lupita nodded. "Javier's supposed to meet us later this afternoon. He said he found something else in the archives that might help." Estella felt her pulse quicken. She spent the morning tending to Havana, her hands moving automatically as her mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. The discovery of the sanctuary, the pendant, the letters, each piece felt like a thread leading her toward a revelation she couldn't yet see. By midday, Javier arrived, his satchel packed with books, papers, and a few old photographs. He spread everything out on the stable's workbench, the sun casting long shadows over the worn wood. "I found references to something called La Promesa de la Tierra," Javier began, adjusting his glasses. "It translates to the promise of the land. It was a pledge made by families like yours, Estella, caretakers who swore to protect certain sacred sites from exploitation or destruction." Estella leaned in, her heart pounding. "So it wasn't just my father. This promise has been passed down for generations." Javier nodded. "Exactly. These sites weren't just important for their spiritual significance. They were places where people found refuge, where communities gathered during times of hardship. Losing them would have meant losing a part of their identity." Lupita frowned. "But if the Mendozas were so devoted to protecting the land, why did they leave?" Why isn't this sanctuary common knowledge? Javier hesitated, flipping through a stack of papers. That's the part I'm still piecing together. There are hints of conflict, disputes over ownership, threats from outside forces. But one thing is clear, someone wanted this land, and the Mendazas had to make sacrifices to keep the sanctuary hidden. Estella's chest tightened as she thought of her father. He must have known all of this. That's why he buried the letters, the map, the key. He was protecting the promise, even if it cost him everything. Javier handed Estella one of the photographs he'd found. It was faded and slightly torn, but she recognized the silhouette of the great oak tree. Beneath its branches stood a group of people, men, women, and children, posing solemnly for the camera. This was taken around 1890, Javier explained. I believe these are some of the original caretakers of the sanctuary. Do you recognize anyone? Estella studied the photograph carefully, her eyes lingering on a man near the center of the group. He stood tall, his expression serious but kind, with eyes that reminded her of her father. That's my grandfather, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I've seen pictures of him before, but never like this. Javier smiled. Then your connection to this land runs deeper than we imagined. This isn't just your father's legacy, it's your entire family's. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the three of them made their way back to the sanctuary. Estella carried the photograph carefully, feeling its weight as though it were another piece of the puzzle her family had left behind. When they arrived, the air around the sanctuary felt charged, as if the land itself recognized their presence. Javier began taking more detailed photographs of the carvings and objects inside, while Lupita sketched the layout of the chamber. Estella stood by the pedestal, her hand resting on the bronze statue of the Virgin. The pendant around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to kneel. Closing her eyes, she whispered a prayer, her words spilling out in a mixture of gratitude and longing. As she stood, her fingers brushed against the edge of the pedestal, and she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint groove running along its base. Kneeling again, she traced the groove until her fingers found a hidden latch. Javier, Lupita, she called, her voice trembling. There's something here. They rushed to her side as Estella pulled the latch. With a soft click, a small compartment opened, revealing a rolled-up parchment sealed with wax. Javier carefully broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. His eyes widened as he read the words aloud. To those who find this, the sanctuary is a testament to love, faith, and resilience. It belongs to all who honor its legacy. Protect it, and it will protect you. Break the promise, and its light will fade. Estella felt a shiver run through her. The words seemed to echo the very essence of what she had felt since discovering the sanctuary. This place wasn't just a secret to be guarded, it was a gift to be cherished. As the three of them stood in the sacred chamber, the light from their lantern seemed to glow brighter, casting a warm, golden hue over the ancient walls. Estella's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. Her father's legacy, her family's promise, and the sanctuary's story were no longer hidden in the shadows. They were alive, ready to be shared with the world, but only on their terms. The sanctuary seemed quieter than ever as Estella, Lupita, and Javier stood in its glow, the words from the parchment lingering in the air. Estella's hands trembled as she held the scroll, the message feeling as if it were meant for her directly, a bridge between the past and her present. We've been entrusted with something extraordinary, Javier said, his voice reverent. This isn't just about preserving the land. It's about honoring the generations who sacrificed to keep this promise alive. Lupita nodded, her skepticism completely gone. But how do we protect something like this? If the wrong people find out, they'll tear it apart for profit or destroy it out of ignorance. Estella looked at the pedestal, her gaze steady. We start by deciding who we trust. We have to be careful, but we can't keep this buried forever. My father didn't want it hidden, he wanted it protected and understood. Javier stepped closer to the pedestal, his brow furrowed as he examined the carvings again. "There's something more here," he murmured, almost to himself. "These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're instructions." Estella and Lupita exchanged a glance. "Instructions for what?" Estella asked. Javier pointed to a series of interconnected lines etched into the stone, forming a pattern that circled the pedestal. This motif repeats in ancient texts about sacred spaces. It often represents a cycle: birth, death, renewal. It's possible that this sanctuary isn't just a static place. It's meant to evolve, to adapt as it's passed to each new generation. Lupita leaned closer, tracing the carvings with her fingers. "If that's true, then maybe the sanctuary has more to reveal. What if there's another part of it we haven't found yet?" The idea sent a ripple of excitement through the group. They began combing through the chamber, tapping on walls, checking for loose stones, and shining their lanterns into every corner. It was Lupita who noticed a faint draft coming from a seam in the back wall. "Over here," she called, her voice echoing through the chamber. Estella and Javier rushed to her side as she pressed her hand against the wall. It was cold and smooth, but there was a slight give to the stone. Together, the three of them pushed until the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passageway descending even deeper into the earth. The air that rushed out was cooler and carried a faint metallic tang. Estella's heart raced as she held up her lantern, illuminating the steps leading down into the darkness. "Do we go?" Lupita asked, her voice low. "We have to," Estella said firmly. One by one, they descended the steps, the passage narrowing as they went. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft scuffing of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. The deeper they went, the more the carvings on the walls changed. The earlier patterns of circles and rays gave way to intricate depictions of people, figures kneeling in prayer, holding hands, or offering gifts to what appeared to be the Virgin of Guadalupe. "These images," Javier whispered, pausing to examine one of the carvings. "They tell a story. This sanctuary wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a place of transformation." As they reached the bottom of the passage, the space opened into another chamber, smaller than the first but equally breathtaking. At its center was a shallow pool of water, its surface shimmering with a faint, otherworldly light. Surrounding the pool were more objects: clay pots filled with dried flowers, bundles of herbs, and small wooden crosses arranged in a careful circle. Estella stepped forward, the pendant around her neck glowing faintly in the lantern light. She knelt by the edge of the pool, her reflection rippling as if the water recognized her presence. "This must be the heart of the sanctuary," she said softly. Javier joined her, studying the objects around the pool. "This is incredible. The water, it's symbolic. A source of life and renewal. But there's something else here." He pointed to an inscription carved into the stone surrounding the pool. Estella leaned closer to read it, her voice trembling as she translated the words aloud. "To drink from this pool is to renew your spirit. To share it is to renew the world." Lupita let out a low whistle. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility." "It is," Estella said, her eyes glistening. "This isn't just water. It's part of the promise. A reminder that we're connected to something greater than ourselves." Javier nodded, his expression solemn. This sanctuary was meant to bring people together. To heal. That's why it was hidden, so it wouldn't be corrupted by greed or ambition. They spent hours documenting the second chamber, careful not to disturb its delicate balance. Estella felt a profound sense of purpose as she moved through the space, the pendant at her neck a constant reminder of her family's connection to this sacred place. As they made their way back to the surface, the weight of their discovery settled over them like a heavy but welcome cloak. The sanctuary wasn't just a place to be preserved, it was a living testament to faith, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of community. That night, as Estella sat alone in her room, she clutched the pendant tightly and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The sanctuary had revealed its secrets, but her journey was far from over. There was still work to be done, stories to be told, and a legacy to protect. The following morning, Estella rose early, the weight of the sanctuary's revelations still heavy on her mind. She stood by her window, watching the sunrise bathe the fields in golden light. In the stillness, the words carved around the pool echoed in her thoughts: to drink from this pool is to renew your spirit. To share it is to renew the world. She couldn't shake the feeling that the sanctuary's secrets were far from fully unraveled. Javier's discovery of the Mendoza family's role, the hidden chambers, and the glowing pool all hinted at a deeper purpose. Estella felt it in her chest, a pull as though the land itself was urging her forward. By mid-morning, Javier and Lupita joined her in the stable, their expressions both eager and cautious. The table in Estella's small room had become their unofficial base of operations, now cluttered with maps, photographs, and notes. Javier placed a new stack of documents on the table. "I went back to the archives last night," he said, adjusting his glasses. "There's a reference to a series of rituals performed in sanctuaries like this one. They weren't just symbolic, they were meant to align the caretakers with the land, the community, and something greater than themselves." Lupita raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying this was, what? Some kind of spiritual training ground?" "Not exactly," Javier replied. "It was more about creating harmony. The caretakers weren't just protecting the sanctuary, they were living embodiments of its values. They were expected to guide others, to heal, and to preserve the balance between the land and its people." Estella listened intently, her hand resting on the pendant around her neck. "That explains why my father felt such a strong connection to this place. He wasn't just guarding it, he was carrying on a tradition." Javier nodded. "Exactly. And now that responsibility has passed to you." Lupita leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "That's a lot to put on one person, don't you think?" "It doesn't have to be just me," Estella said, her voice steady. "We're all connected to this land now. The sanctuary chose us, just like it chose my father and the generations before him." Javier tapped the map spread out on the table. "There's one more thing. The symbols we found in the second chamber, they're linked to something called El Ciclo del Renacer, or the Cycle of Renewal. It's mentioned in an old manuscript I found, but the details are vague. All I know is that it involves the pool and the pendant." Estella's fingers tightened around the pendant. "What do we need to do?" Javier hesitated. "The manuscript describes a ritual of renewal, but it's incomplete. It says the caretaker must offer their truth to the sanctuary and embrace the promise of the land. Beyond that, it's unclear." Lupita frowned. "Offer their truth? That could mean anything." "It's not just words," Estella said softly. "It's about intention. The sanctuary doesn't want us to act out of greed or fear, it wants us to act out of love and respect." Her conviction silenced the room. After a long pause, Javier nodded. "If anyone can complete this ritual, it's you, Estella. You're the bridge between the past and the present." The decision was made. They would return to the sanctuary that evening, carrying the pendant and the photograph of the original caretakers. Estella felt a quiet resolve settle over her as they prepared. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in twilight, they made their way to the sanctuary. The air was cool and still, and the faint sound of crickets filled the night. The lanterns they carried cast flickering shadows on the ancient walls as they descended into the second chamber. The pool's surface shimmered faintly, its glow more pronounced in the darkness. Estella knelt by its edge, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand. Javier and Lupita stood a few steps behind her, their silence a sign of respect for the moment. Closing her eyes, Estella took a deep breath. She thought of her father, of his love for this land, and the sacrifices he had made to protect it. She thought of the generations who had come before him, their hands shaping the sanctuary into what it was now. When she opened her eyes, she spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Sanctuary, I offer you my truth. I am Estella Mendoza, daughter of this land, keeper of its promise. I vow to honor its legacy, to protect its secrets, and to share its light with those who will respect it." As she finished, she lowered the pendant into the pool. The water rippled, and the glow intensified, spreading outward until the entire chamber was bathed in golden light. Estella felt a warmth radiating from the pendant, as if the sanctuary itself were answering her vow. Lupita gasped, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful." Javier stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've completed the ritual." The glow gradually faded, leaving the chamber in serene stillness. Estella retrieved the pendant, its surface warm to the touch. She felt a deep sense of peace, as though the sanctuary had accepted her offering. As they ascended back to the surface, the night sky was filled with stars, their light crisp and bright. Estella looked up, the pendant resting against her chest. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she felt ready to face them. The sanctuary's promise wasn't just her responsibility, it was her calling. And now, she had the strength to honor it. The following morning, Estella awoke with a profound sense of purpose. The pendant rested on her chest, its presence no longer heavy but grounding, as if it were an anchor connecting her to the sanctuary and the promise she had made. The stable was quiet, the early morning light filtering through cracks in the wooden walls. She moved through her chores with a calm focus, each task feeling more meaningful now. The horses, as if sensing the shift in her spirit, seemed calmer too, their movements slower and more deliberate. Lupita entered the stable carrying a steaming mug of coffee, her expression curious but lighter than usual. "You're up early," she said, handing the mug to Estella. Estella smiled faintly. "There's a lot to think about." "Like what?" Lupita asked, leaning against the wall. Estella took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her hands. "About what comes next. The sanctuary, the land, it's all connected. It's not just about preserving it. It's about sharing it with the right people." Lupita raised an eyebrow. "The right people? How do we decide who that is?" Before Estella could answer, Javier arrived, his satchel slung over one shoulder and his face alight with excitement. "I found something new," he announced, setting the bag down on a hay bale and pulling out a rolled-up piece of parchment. "What is it?" Estella asked, stepping closer. Javier unrolled the parchment carefully, revealing a detailed map of the surrounding region. "It's a historical map of the area," he explained. "It shows the sanctuary, but it also marks something else, another site, just beyond the hills to the south." Lupita frowned, leaning over the map. "Another site? You're saying there's more to this than just the sanctuary?" "It seems that way," Javier said. "This second site is marked with the same symbols we found in the sanctuary's carvings. It might be connected, or it could be something entirely different. Either way, we need to investigate." Estella studied the map, her finger tracing the path leading from the sanctuary to the marked site. "If it's connected, it could explain why my father was so protective of this land. Maybe the sanctuary wasn't the only place he was trying to guard." Lupita sighed, crossing her arms. "We barely know how to protect what we've already found. Now there's more." Estella placed a reassuring hand on Lupita's arm. "We'll take it one step at a time. This is bigger than any of us, but we're not in this alone." By midday, the three of them were packed and ready to explore the new site. They followed the map's path, which led them through a series of overgrown trails winding into the hills. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the dense canopy of trees providing shade but also an eerie stillness. As they reached the marked location, they found themselves standing before a clearing surrounded by tall, jagged rocks. In the center was a circular stone platform, weathered by time but still intact. The carvings on its surface were similar to those in the sanctuary, rays of light radiating from a central point, surrounded by intricate patterns of vines and flowers. "This must be it," Javier said, stepping onto the platform. He crouched to examine the carvings, running his fingers over the grooves. "It's another sacred space, but it feels different." Estella knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the center of the platform. A small depression in the stone caught her attention. "This looks like a keyhole," she said, glancing at Javier. Lupita stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't think?" Estella pulled the pendant from around her neck and held it over the keyhole. The design matched perfectly. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before lowering the pendant into the depression. The ground beneath them rumbled softly, and a faint light began to emanate from the carvings. The vines and rays seemed to glow, as if the platform were coming alive. Lupita stepped back, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. "What is happening?" The light intensified, and a sound like rushing wind filled the clearing. Estella stood still, her hand resting on the pendant, as the platform center began to shift. A small compartment opened, revealing a cylindrical object wrapped in cloth. Javier carefully reached in and retrieved the object, unwrapping it to reveal a scroll sealed with wax. "Another message," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Estella took the scroll from him, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, the ancient script etched in precise lines. "To the caretakers of the light, you stand at the threshold of unity. What you hold is the key to restoring what was lost. Share this truth wisely, for the balance of this land depends on your strength and faith." The words hung heavy in the air. Estella felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her. This wasn't just about her family or the sanctuary, it was about the land itself, its history, and its future. As they stood in the clearing, the light from the platform began to fade, leaving only the faint glow of the carvings. The pendant felt warm against Estella's chest, as if reminding her of the weight she now carried. Lupita broke the silence. "So, what do we do now?" Estella looked at her, her expression calm but resolute. "We protect it. All of it. And we find the others who can help us keep the promise alive." Javier nodded, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about discovery. It's about stewardship. We're not just uncovering the past, we're shaping the future." Together, they began the journey back, the scroll and the pendant safely in Estella's care. The hills seemed quieter now, as if the land itself was watching, waiting for them to fulfill the promise. And Estella, with her heart full of purpose and her spirit renewed, was ready. As the three of them descended from the hills, the weight of their discovery lingered like a quiet storm within Estella's chest. The scroll, now carefully wrapped in cloth and tucked into Javier's satchel, felt as though it carried the voices of the past. The path back to the stable was steep and uneven, but the silence between them wasn't discomfort, it was reflection. When they reached the familiar site of the stable, Havana greeted them with a soft whinny, her head leaning out of the stall as if sensing Estella's thoughts. Estella approached the mare, resting her hand on her neck, drawing strength from the animal's steady presence. Lupita was the first to speak, breaking the stillness as she set her bag down on a bale of hay. "We've uncovered so much, but I can't help wondering, if this is just the beginning, how much more is out there?" Javier pulled the scroll from his satchel and set it on the table in Estella's room. "That's exactly what we need to figure out." The scroll mentioned others, other caretakers, other keys to this land's balance. This isn't just about one sanctuary or one site. It's a network, a legacy built over generations. Estella sat down slowly, her eyes locked on the scroll. But why now? Why is all of this revealing itself now, after so many years of silence? Javier's voice softened. "Because the promise was never broken. Your father, the Mendoza family, they kept it alive, even when the world forgot. And now, it's looking for renewal, for someone to honor it again." Lupita paced the room, her arms crossed tightly. But what does that mean for us? This land isn't just a sacred site. It's also my livelihood. The stable, the horses, they're part of this too. How do we balance both? Estella looked up, her gaze steady. We honor both. The sanctuary isn't asking us to choose, it's asking us to respect what's already here. The horses, the land, the people who live and work here, they're all connected to its story. Lupita exhaled sharply but nodded. Okay. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. No one can find out until we're ready to protect what we've found. Javier tapped the scroll gently. That starts with understanding what's written here. There's more to this message than we realize. The symbols, the language, it's layered, like a puzzle. We need to decode it before we take the next step. Estella nodded. Then let's get to work. The next few days passed in a blur of research and preparation. Javier pored over the scroll, comparing its symbols and phrases to the historical texts he had access to. Lupita focused on maintaining the stable, carefully balancing her responsibilities while keeping an eye on the growing number of visitors and deliveries to the property. Estella, meanwhile, felt an almost magnetic pull back to the sanctuary. Each morning, after finishing her chores, she would visit the site, spending hours in quiet reflection. The sanctuary felt alive, as if it were watching her, guiding her. One morning, as she knelt by the glowing pool in the second chamber, she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint pattern of light radiating outward from the water, forming shapes on the chamber's walls. She tilted her lantern to get a better look and realized the shapes resembled the carvings on the pendant. Her breath caught. Was the sanctuary revealing more of its secrets? She rushed back to the stable to share her discovery. Javier and Lupita were deep in discussion when she burst into the room, her face flushed with urgency. There's more, she said, holding the pendant up. The pool, it's reflecting patterns onto the walls. They match the symbols on the pendant. Javier immediately grabbed his notebook and followed her back to the sanctuary, Lupita trailing close behind. When they reached the chamber, Estella pointed to the walls, where the faint patterns shimmered like ripples of light. Javier stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shapes. These aren't just symbols, he said, his voice laced with awe. They're coordinates, directions to something else. Another site? Lupita asked, her tone a mix of frustration and fascination. Possibly, Javier said. But it could also be a message. A way to understand what connects these places to each other. Estella felt a surge of determination. Then we follow the trail. Whatever this is leading us to, it's part of the promise. We can't stop now. The three of them spent hours mapping the patterns, carefully documenting every detail. As the day turned to evening, they returned to the stable, exhausted but energized by their findings. That night, as Estella sat alone in her room, she opened her father's letters once again. The words felt different now, more alive, as if they were speaking directly to her. The land holds more than its surface reveals. Protect it, and it will protect you. Trust in its light, and it will guide you home. She traced the lines with her fingers, her heart swelling with both gratitude and responsibility. The sanctuary had chosen her to carry its legacy, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she felt ready. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Estella whispered a quiet prayer, her voice steady and clear. I will honor the promise, Papa. No matter what it takes. The wind outside seemed to carry her words, rustling the trees in a gentle, approving whisper. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Estella felt she wasn't walking it alone. The land, the sanctuary, and her father's spirit were with her, every step of the way. The morning light spilled into Estella's room, waking her gently. The pendant, now a constant presence around her neck, felt warm against her chest. It had become more than a relic of her father's past, it was a symbol of the bond between her family, the sanctuary, and the land itself. When she emerged from her room, Lupita was already outside, leaning against the stable gate, her arms crossed as she stared toward the fields. Javier stood nearby, flipping through one of his notebooks, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Good morning," Estella called, her voice soft but purposeful. Lupita turned, her expression unreadable. "Morning. Javier's got something to share." Javier looked up, his face brightening with excitement. "I stayed up late last night comparing the patterns we found in the sanctuary to some of the historical records from the archives. I think I've identified where the coordinates lead." He unrolled a map on the nearest flat surface, smoothing it with his hands. "The patterns from the pool's reflection point to an area just outside the village. It's marked as a grove on older maps, but it's been largely forgotten. People stopped going there decades ago. It's considered cursed." "Cursed?" Lupita repeated, her skepticism evident. Javier shrugged. "It's just a local legend. Something about bad harvests and strange occurrences. But if the sanctuary's carvings are accurate, this grove might be the next piece of the puzzle." Estella leaned over the map, her finger tracing the marked location. "It makes sense. The sanctuary isn't just a single site, it's part of something bigger. We need to see this grove for ourselves." Lupita hesitated, her arms tightening across her chest. "Do we really want to mess with something people think is cursed? This land is complicated enough as it is." Estella met her gaze, her voice calm but firm. "The sanctuary chose us, Lupita. If it's leading us there, we have to trust it. The promise isn't about avoiding what's hard, it's about facing it." Lupita sighed but nodded. "Fine. But if we find something dangerous, we turn back." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Estella said. They packed quickly, bringing lanterns, notebooks, and a few tools for digging if needed. The walk to the grove was longer than expected, the path overgrown and winding. The air grew heavier as they approached, the stillness almost unnatural. When they reached the grove, Estella stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The clearing was surrounded by gnarled trees, their roots twisting like veins through the earth. In the center stood a massive stone monolith, its surface covered in carvings that mirrored those in the sanctuary. "This is it," Javier said, his voice low. "This is what the coordinates pointed to." They approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The carvings on the monolith were more intricate than anything they had seen before, rays of light, spiraling vines, and figures holding hands in a circle. Estella stepped closer, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone. A faint hum resonated beneath her touch, as if the monolith were alive. "There's energy here," she said softly. "Do you feel it?" Lupita shivered, rubbing her arms. "Yeah, I feel it. And it's giving me goosebumps." Javier crouched near the base of the monolith, examining a series of symbols etched into the ground. "These markings, they're similar to the ones around the pool in the sanctuary. But there's something different here." Estella knelt beside him, her pendant glowing faintly in the filtered light. "What do you mean?" Javier pointed to a symbol near the center. It was a circle with lines radiating outward, like a sunburst, but the lines were broken in several places. "This isn't just a design. It's a warning." "A warning for what?" Lupita asked, her voice tight. "I'm not sure," Javier admitted. "But it could explain why people thought this place was cursed. Something happened here, something that disrupted the balance." Estella stared at the broken sunburst, her mind racing. If the sanctuary is about renewal, then maybe this grove is about restoration. "It's not cursed, it's unfinished." Lupita frowned. "And how exactly are we supposed to restore it?" Before Estella could answer, the pendant around her neck grew warmer, almost uncomfortably so. She gasped, her hand flying to the pendant as a faint light began to emanate from its center. "Estella, what's happening?" Javier asked, his voice urgent. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. It's like the pendant is reacting to the grove. The light from the pendant intensified, casting a golden glow over the clearing. The carvings on the monolith began to shimmer, the broken sunburst slowly knitting itself back together. The hum beneath their feet grew louder, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of Estella's heartbeat. Lupita took a step back, her eyes wide. "This isn't normal, Estella." "It's the promise," Estella said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "The land is healing itself." As the light reached its peak, the hum abruptly stopped. The grove fell silent, the air lighter than before. The carvings on the monolith now glowed faintly, their broken lines restored. Javier exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "You did it, Estella. You completed the cycle." Estella touched the pendant, its warmth now a comforting presence. "We didn't just find the promise. We fulfilled it." Lupita shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're full of surprises, Estella. I'll give you that." As they stood in the clearing, surrounded by the restored monolith and the quiet hum of the grove, Estella felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The promise had been honored, but she knew their journey wasn't over. The sanctuary, the land, and the legacy of the Mendoza family had much more to reveal, and Estella was ready to listen. The golden light of the restored monolith faded into the soft glow of the early evening, leaving Estella, Lupita, and Javier standing in the grove's now transformed stillness. The air was lighter, carrying a faint, sweet scent of wildflowers that hadn't been there before. Even the trees seemed less gnarled, their branches reaching upward like arms in quiet celebration. Estella's hand lingered on the pendant, the warmth still thrumming faintly against her chest. She turned to the others, her voice steady but filled with awe. "This place, it feels different now. Like it's finally at peace." Javier knelt beside the monolith, his fingers tracing the now complete sunburst carving. "The energy here has shifted," he said. "Whatever imbalance existed, it's been resolved. The grove is no longer cursed, it's healed." Lupita, who had been pacing in quiet contemplation, stopped and looked back at them. "If the grove is part of the promise, what happens now? Do we just leave it here? Or is there something more we're supposed to do?" Estella considered her words, her gaze drifting to the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "I don't think we're meant to keep this a secret forever," she said thoughtfully. "But we need to be careful. This isn't just ours to claim, it belongs to everyone who honors its purpose." Javier stood, dusting off his hands. "We should document everything, every carving, every detail. If this grove is connected to the sanctuary, it could help us understand the full scope of the promise." They spent the next several hours working methodically. Javier photographed the carvings and measured the dimensions of the monolith, his excitement tempered by his meticulous attention to detail. Lupita sketched the grove, marking the placement of the trees and the surrounding terrain. Estella walked the perimeter, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she were listening to the land itself. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the grove took on a tranquil beauty, the restored carvings glowing faintly in the twilight. The three of them stood together near the monolith, exhaustion mingling with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "We should head back," Lupita said, breaking the silence. "It's getting late, and I don't want to be stuck out here in the dark." Estella nodded, though her eyes lingered on the monolith one last time. "You're right. But we'll return. This place still has more to teach us." The walk back to the stable was quieter than their journey to the grove. The weight of what they had accomplished filled the air between them, unspoken but deeply felt. When they arrived, Havana greeted them with an eager whinny, her head bobbing over the stall door. "She always knows when something's changed," Estella said with a soft smile, stroking the mare's neck. Lupita chuckled. "Maybe she's part of the promise too." Inside the stable, Javier spread his notes and photographs across the table. "There's a pattern emerging," he said, pointing to the images of the monolith's carvings and the sanctuary's symbols. "The sunburst, the circles, the vines, they all represent cycles. Not just of renewal, but of connection. These places are tied together, and each one plays a role in maintaining the balance. Estella leaned over the table, her brow furrowed in thought. But if the grove was broken, does that mean other places might be, too? What if this isn't the only part of the promise that's been damaged? Javier nodded. It's possible. If the sanctuary and the grove are part of a larger network, then their balance depends on each other. We might need to find the other sites to ensure the entire system is intact. Lupita sighed, rubbing her temples. You're saying there could be more places like this? More monoliths, more carvings, more, whatever this is? Estella met her gaze, her expression calm but resolute. If there are, then it's our responsibility to find them. The promise wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. It's meant to guide us, to heal what's been broken. The three of them sat in silence for a while, the enormity of their task settling over them like a heavy but welcome cloak. Finally, Estella spoke, her voice filled with quiet determination. We'll start tomorrow. If the sanctuary led us to the grove, it will guide us to the next place too. We just have to listen. That night, Estella stood outside her room, gazing up at the stars. The pendant around her neck felt lighter now, as if it had accepted her as its caretaker. She whispered a quiet prayer, her words carried away on the cool night breeze. Thank you, Papa. I'll protect the promise. I'll honor the light. In the distance, the faint hum of the sanctuary seemed to echo her vow, a gentle reminder that she wasn't walking this path alone. The land, the sanctuary, and the legacy of her family were with her, guiding her toward whatever lay ahead. The next morning, Estella awoke to a soft knock on her door. She sat up quickly, her hand instinctively going to the pendant around her neck. The knock came again, and she recognized Lupita's voice. Estella, Javier says he's found something. You need to see this. Sliding out of bed, Estella quickly dressed and stepped into the crisp morning air. The stable buzzed with quiet activity, the horses stirring in their stalls, the sunlight breaking through the gaps in the wooden walls. Javier was already at the table, a mix of excitement and urgency in his expression. I've been up all night cross-referencing the carvings from the grove with the sanctuary symbols, he began, gesturing to the pages spread out in front of him. And I think I've found the next location. Estella leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the drawings and notes. Where? Javier pointed to a section of the map he had drawn. It's further south, near a dry riverbed. There's a site marked on an older map as El Rio Dormido, the sleeping river. From what I've read, it was once a vital water source for the region, but it dried up decades ago. There's almost no mention of it in modern records. Lupita frowned, her arms crossed. Why would the promise lead us to a dried-up river? That doesn't sound promising. It makes sense, Estella said, her voice steady. If the sanctuary is about renewal and the grove was about restoration, maybe this place is about recovery. A river that's been forgotten, like the promise itself. Javier nodded. That's exactly what I'm thinking. And if the patterns hold, there could be another monolith or structure there, something tied to the network of sites. Lupita sighed, shaking her head. All right, but let's not forget we're dealing with old maps and legends. For all we know, this riverbed could be nothing but rocks and dust. Estella met her gaze, her expression calm but resolute. Then we'll find out. The land hasn't misled us yet. They packed quickly, bringing water, lanterns, and tools for clearing debris. The journey to El Rio Dormido was longer than their previous expeditions, the trail rough and uneven. As they approached the area marked on the map, the landscape changed, the vibrant greens of the fields gave way to dry, cracked earth. The air grew hotter, the sun beating down on them as they walked. When they reached the dry riverbed, they stopped, surveying the desolate scene. The ground was a patchwork of deep fissures, the remnants of a once thriving waterway etched into the earth like scars. This is it, Javier said, checking the map. The markings indicate that the site is somewhere along this stretch. They began to search, spreading out along the riverbed, scanning the area for anything that resembled the carvings or symbols they had seen before. Hours passed, the heat draining their energy, but Estella refused to give up. Finally, she stopped, her foot catching on something buried in the dirt. She knelt down, brushing away the dry soil to reveal a stone slab covered in faint carvings. Her heart raced as she recognized the sunburst symbol, its rays partially obscured by the earth. "Over here," she called, her voice echoing through the empty riverbed. Javier and Lupita rushed to her side, their eyes widening as they took in the discovery. Together, they cleared the rest of the dirt, revealing a circular platform similar to the one in the grove. "This is it," Javier said, his voice filled with awe. "The sleeping river's heart." Estella stood, the pendant glowing faintly against her chest. She stepped onto the platform, feeling a faint hum beneath her feet. The carving seemed to pulse with energy, as though the site was waking up after years of dormancy. "What now?" Lupita asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. Estella knelt at the center of the platform, her hand resting on the pendant. Closing her eyes, she whispered, "Sanctuary, guide us. Show us what needs to be done." The ground beneath her shifted slightly, and the platform began to glow. A faint trickle of water emerged from one of the cracks in the riverbed, snaking its way toward the platform. It wasn't much, just a thin stream, but it shimmered with an unnatural light. Javier stared, his mouth slightly open. "It's the river. It's coming back." Lupita took a step back, her eyes wide. "How is this possible? This place has been dry for decades." Estella stood, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "The land is responding to the promise. It's not just about us restoring it, it's restoring itself." As the water continued to flow, the carvings on the platform grew brighter, the hum beneath their feet resonating like a heartbeat. Estella felt a deep connection to the site, as if the land was speaking to her, its gratitude flowing through the pendant. When the glow finally dimmed, the water formed a small pool at the base of the platform, its surface clear and still. The air around them felt cooler, fresher, as though the land itself had exhaled. "We've done something here," Javier said quietly. "Something extraordinary." Lupita nodded slowly, her earlier skepticism replaced by quiet wonder. "I can't believe it, but it's real. The promise is real." Estella knelt by the pool, her reflection rippling in the water. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, her voice steady and sure. "Thank you for trusting us. We'll protect you. We'll honor you." As they packed up to leave, the sound of the flowing water followed them, a gentle reminder that the land was alive and watching. Estella felt a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of the promise no longer a burden but a blessing. The sleeping river had awakened, and with it, the next chapter of their journey had begun. The gentle trickle of water from the newly awakened river followed Estella, Lupita, and Javier as they made their way back to the stable. The air seemed different now, cooler, fresher, as if the land itself were celebrating its revival. Estella walked slightly ahead, the pendant around her neck glowing faintly in the soft twilight. When they arrived at the stable, the familiar sounds of the horses greeted them, but the atmosphere felt more vibrant, alive. Lupita headed straight for the water troughs, muttering something about needing to make up for the hours they'd been gone, while Javier spread his notes and photographs across the work table. Estella lingered near Havana's stall, stroking the mare's soft coat. The pendant was still warm, as if it carried the memory of the river's awakening. She whispered softly to the horse, her voice steady and calm. "We're doing it, Havana. Piece by piece, we're bringing it all back." Behind her, Javier cleared his throat. "Estella, I've been thinking," he said, gesturing for her to join him at the table. "Each of these sites, the sanctuary, the grove, the river, they're connected, but they're also distinct. They each represent something: renewal, restoration, recovery. I think there's a larger pattern here, something we haven't uncovered yet. Estella sat down, her eyes scanning the maps and notes Javier had laid out. What kind of pattern? Javier tapped a series of marks on the map, each representing the sites they had discovered so far. These aren't random locations. If you look at them together, they form a shape, a constellation, almost. And if my calculations are correct, there's one more site. One more. Lupita said, stepping into the room with a water bucket in hand. You mean we're not done yet? Javier shook his head. I don't think so. The pattern points to a central location, a place where all the other sites converge. If the sanctuary is the heart of the promise, this last site might be its soul. Estella's breath caught. Do you know where it is? Javier nodded, though his expression was cautious. It's not far, but it's on private land. The area is marked as a hacienda, but it's been abandoned for years. Getting there might be tricky. Lupita crossed her arms. Abandoned haciendas don't just sit empty around here. Someone must still own it. They do, Javier said. But the family that owns the land moved to the city decades ago. The place has been left to decay, and no one's paid much attention to it since. Estella's eyes narrowed. Then we need to go. If this is the final piece of the promise, we can't leave it hidden. Lupita sighed, running a hand through her hair. Let me guess. You want to leave at dawn? Yes, Estella said firmly. The promise is guiding us. We can't ignore it. The next morning, the three of them set out early, their supplies packed and their resolve unwavering. The journey to the hacienda was shorter than expected, but as they approached, the air grew heavy with silence. The building loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time. Vines crawled up the stone walls, their tendrils creeping into broken windows. The gate hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. Despite its state of decay, the hacienda exuded an air of quiet dignity, as if it were waiting for someone to notice it again. This place gives me the creeps, Lupita muttered, glancing around the overgrown courtyard. Javier ignored her, his eyes fixed on the pendant around Estella's neck. It glowed brighter with each step she took toward the entrance. The promise is here, he said quietly. I can feel it. Estella pushed open the heavy wooden doors, their creak echoing through the empty halls. The interior was dim, shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls and ceiling. Dust hung in the air, and the faint scent of earth and decay filled their noses. It feels different, Estella said, her voice reverent. They moved carefully through the halls, their footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. The pendant's glow grew stronger, guiding them toward a grand central room. In its center stood a stone altar, weathered but intact, its surface etched with the same sunburst symbol they had seen at every other site. This is it, Javier said, his voice filled with awe. Estella approached the altar, the pendant pulsing with energy. As she placed her hand on the cold stone, the carvings began to glow, their light spreading outward across the floor in intricate patterns. The air grew warmer, and the room filled with a low, resonant hum. What's happening? Lupita asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. The promise is speaking, Estella said, her eyes fixed on the altar. A section of the floor near the altar shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, weathered box. Estella knelt, her hands trembling as she opened it. The box contained a single piece of parchment and a delicate silver ring engraved with the sunburst symbol. She unfolded the parchment, her voice steady as she read aloud. To the keepers of the light, you have found the source. This is the soul of the promise, the heart of its truth. Protect it, and the land will flourish. Break it, and all will fade. Carry its light forward, and you will be its guardians for all time. As the words settled in the air, the room grew still. Estella slipped the ring onto her finger, its fit perfect, as if it had been made for her. The pendant grew warm against her chest, its glow fading to a soft, steady light. Lupita let out a shaky breath. So, this is it? The end of the journey? No, Estella said, standing and turning to face them. This is the beginning. The promise wasn't just about finding the sights. It's about carrying their light forward, sharing their truth, and ensuring the balance is never lost again. Javier nodded, his gaze steady. The land has trusted us with its legacy. Now we have to honor it. As they left the hacienda, the sun rose higher in the sky, its light casting long shadows over the crumbling building. Estella felt a deep sense of peace, but also responsibility. The promise had been fulfilled, but its legacy was now hers to carry. And she would carry it, faithfully, lovingly, and with unwavering resolve. As Estella, Javier, and Lupita returned to the stable, the weight of their discovery settled over them like a sacred shroud. The ring on Estella's finger felt light yet powerful, as if it carried the voices of generations past. The pendant, now dim but still warm against her chest, seemed to hum faintly in rhythm with her heartbeat. The stable was quiet when they arrived, the horses resting in their stalls. Havana greeted Estella with a gentle nudge, her large eyes watching her intently, almost knowingly. Estella smiled, stroking the mare's nose. We did it, Havana. We found the heart of the promise. Now we just have to protect it. Lupita set her bag down on a bale of hay and exhaled deeply, running a hand through her hair. I can't believe what we've uncovered. First the sanctuary, then the grove, and now this, the soul of the promise. It's a lot to take in. Javier, already pulling out his notebook, began sketching the altar and the ring's engraving. It's overwhelming, he admitted, but it all makes sense. Each site represents a piece of the whole. The sanctuary was the heart, the grove was the connection to nature, the river was renewal, and the hacienda was the soul, the essence tying everything together. But what now? Lupita asked, leaning against the worktable. We've found everything. The promise has been fulfilled, hasn't it? Estella looked at her, her gaze calm but resolute. Fulfilling the promise was only the first step. Now we have to ensure it's never broken again. That means sharing its story with the right people, people who will honor it and protect it. Javier nodded. We also need to document everything thoroughly. The carvings, the symbols, the sites, we have to preserve the knowledge so future generations understand what's at stake. Lupita folded her arms. That's easier said than done. Not everyone will care about the promise. Some people might see this as an opportunity to exploit the land for their own gain. That's why we have to be careful, Estella said. This isn't just about the land. It's about faith, balance, and connection. The promise isn't something that can be owned, it's something that has to be respected. The three of them spent the next few days working tirelessly. Javier compiled all their notes and photographs into a detailed record of their discoveries, while Lupita coordinated with trusted community members who could help protect the land. Estella, meanwhile, returned to each site, spending hours at the sanctuary, the grove, and the river, listening to the land and ensuring its energy remained balanced. One afternoon, as she stood by the glowing pool in the sanctuary, she felt a sudden rush of emotion. Memories of her father flooded her mind, his laughter, his steady hands guiding hers as a child, his unwavering belief in the importance of the land. She knelt by the pool, tears streaming down her face. Papa, she whispered, her voice trembling. I finally understand. You weren't just protecting the land, you were protecting the soul of our family, of our community. Thank you for trusting me to carry this forward. I promise I won't let you down. The light from the pool seemed to brighten, as if answering her vow. That evening, Javier called a meeting in the stable with a small group of villagers, people they trusted deeply. Among them were local farmers, teachers, and elders who had lived in the area for decades. Javier laid out their findings, carefully explaining the significance of each site and the promise that connected them all. At first, there was silence. Then an older woman named Dona Rosa, known for her wisdom and quiet strength, spoke. "This land has always been special," she said, her voice steady. "We've felt it, even if we didn't understand it. Thank you for uncovering its truth. It's our duty now to protect it together." One by one, the villagers nodded, their faces filled with a mix of awe and determination. Lupita glanced at Estella, her usual skepticism replaced by a rare smile. "Looks like we've got our first allies," she said quietly. Estella smiled back. "This is how it begins. One step at a time." As the meeting ended and the villagers left, Estella, Javier, and Lupita stood together in the stable, their exhaustion tempered by a quiet sense of triumph. The promise had been shared, and the first seeds of its protection had been planted. Looking out at the darkened fields, Estella felt a profound sense of peace. The land seemed to hum with gratitude, its energy weaving through the stars and the earth below. The promise was no longer a forgotten secret, it was alive, a beacon of hope and resilience. And Estella knew, deep in her heart, that her journey with the promise was far from over. The days that followed the meeting with the villagers were a blur of quiet progress and cautious optimism. Word about the discoveries began to spread, but carefully and only to those the group trusted. Estella, Lupita, and Javier found themselves at the center of a growing effort to protect the promise and the land, their responsibilities expanding in ways none of them had anticipated. One morning, Estella sat at the stable's work table, the pendant resting on the wood in front of her. Its faint glow had become a source of comfort, a quiet reassurance that the land's energy was alive and present. Javier was beside her, poring over the growing collection of maps, drawings, and notes. Lupita entered, carrying a bundle of fresh herbs she had collected from the grove. "These should help with the horses," she said, setting the bundle down. "The grove's energy feels different now, healthier. Even the plants are thriving." Estella smiled. "The land is healing. It's like it's responding to the promise being renewed." Javier looked up from his notes, his expression thoughtful. "That's something I've been thinking about," he said. "The land isn't just healing itself, it's reaching out to us, guiding us. But what happens if we stop listening?" Lupita raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying we could lose everything we've gained?" "Not if we stay vigilant," Estella said firmly. "The promise isn't just about discovering the sights, it's about living in harmony with the land, every day. That's the real challenge." Javier nodded. "And it's why we need more people to understand the significance of what we've found. The more allies we have, the stronger the promise will be." That afternoon, the three of them returned to the sanctuary to continue their work. The chamber felt warmer now, its glow steady and inviting. Estella knelt by the pool, dipping her fingers into the cool, clear water. The ripples spread outward, catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. "What do you feel?" Javier asked, his voice soft. Estella closed her eyes, focusing on the sensation of the water against her skin. "It feels alive. Like it's watching us, waiting to see what we'll do next." Lupita stood near the entrance, her arms crossed. "It's strange to think that all of this was here, just waiting. If we hadn't found the letters, the map, none of this would have come to light." Javier stepped closer, his expression serious. "But it did. And now it's our responsibility to ensure it's never forgotten again." As they prepared to leave, Estella placed the pendant on the pedestal at the center of the chamber. The light around the pool brightened momentarily, as if acknowledging her gesture. "The promise isn't just a duty," she said, her voice steady. "It's a gift. And we have to treat it that way." A sudden challenge. The following week brought unexpected complications. A local developer, Don Ignacio, arrived in the village, his interest in the land quickly becoming apparent. He was a charismatic man, his sharp suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. Lupita was the first to spot him, her instincts immediately on high alert. "We've got trouble," she said, barging into the stable where Estella and Javier were reviewing their notes. What kind of trouble? Estella asked, setting down her pen. There's a man asking questions about the land, Lupita said. He's claiming he has rights to part of it, especially near the grove and the riverbed. Javier's expression darkened. That's impossible. Those areas were designated community land years ago. Tell that to him, Lupita said. He's already talking to some of the villagers, trying to convince them he can improve the land and bring in money. Estella's chest tightened. If he gets access to the grove or the river, everything we've worked for could be destroyed. They decided to confront Don Ignacio directly. Meeting him in the village square, they found him speaking to a small group of villagers, his voice smooth and persuasive. This land has potential, he was saying. With the right investment, it could become a tourist destination, bringing jobs and prosperity to everyone here. Prosperity at what cost? Estella's voice rang out, firm and clear. The crowd parted as she approached, Javier and Lupita close behind her. Don Ignacio turned, his expression unreadable. Ah, you must be one of the caretakers of the land. It's an honor to meet you. Estella's gaze was steady. This land doesn't need your kind of improvement. It's thriving as it is, because it's being respected, not exploited. Ignacio's smile was thin. Respect and progress aren't mutually exclusive. Imagine what we could achieve if we worked together. A sanctuary. A restored river. These could be attractions, drawing people from all over. They're not attractions, Estella said sharply. They're sacred. They belong to the land, not to you or anyone else. The crowd murmured, some of the villagers looking uneasy. Estella glanced at Dona Rosa, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Ignacio's eyes narrowed. Sacred or not, land is land. And land can be bought. Not this land, Javier interjected. We have documentation proving its historical and cultural significance. If you try to claim it, you'll face legal challenges, and the community will stand against you. Ignacio's smile faltered, his polished demeanor slipping just slightly. We'll see about that, he said, turning sharply and walking away. Estella exhaled, her fists clenched at her sides. This isn't over. No, Lupita said, watching Ignacio disappear down the road. But neither are we. As the villagers gathered around them, Estella felt a surge of determination. The promise was stronger than any threat, and with the community by their side, they would protect it. The tension in the village thickened in the days following Don Ignacio's arrival. His polished rhetoric and vague promises of wealth stirred unease among the villagers, some of whom began to wonder if his offers might bring the stability they had long sought. But Estella, Lupita, and Javier worked tirelessly to counter his influence, spreading the truth about the land's sacred legacy and its delicate balance. One evening, Estella gathered a group of villagers at the sanctuary, her voice firm and clear as she spoke beneath the soft glow of the pool. This land doesn't just belong to us, she said, her gaze sweeping across the group. It belongs to those who came before us and to those who will come after. The promise isn't about profit or ownership, it's about stewardship. It's about protecting the soul of our community. Dona Rosa stepped forward, her weathered face lit with quiet conviction. Estella is right. We've felt this land's energy for generations, even if we didn't understand it. We can't let someone like Don Ignacio destroy what makes it special. The villagers murmured their agreement, the tide of doubt beginning to turn. Javier presented his research, showing photographs and documents that connected the sanctuary, the grove, and the river to the region's history. This isn't just a local treasure, he said. It's a piece of our shared heritage. Protecting it isn't just a choice, it's our responsibility. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The villagers agreed to stand together against any attempts to exploit the land, their unity a quiet but powerful force. Ignacio strikes back. The next morning, Estella and Lupita woke to find a group of Ignacio's workers gathered near the grove, their tools gleaming in the early sunlight. Machines were already rumbling, the sound jarring against the tranquil hum of the land. Estella's heart clenched. "He's wasting no time," she said, her voice tight with anger. Lupita grabbed her arm. "We can't let this happen." They rushed to the site, where Ignacio stood overseeing the workers with a smug expression. "What do you think you're doing?" Estella demanded, her voice cutting through the din. Ignacio turned slowly, his smile thin. "Improving the land. Isn't that what you wanted?" "This land isn't yours to touch," Estella said, her voice trembling with fury. Ignacio raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, I've secured temporary permits to begin development. It's all perfectly legal." Javier arrived moments later, clutching a folder of documents. "Those permits won't hold up," he said. "We've filed for protective status for this land. Any action you take here will be challenged in court." Ignacio's smile faltered for a moment before returning, colder this time. "You're welcome to try," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Estella stepped forward, her hand instinctively resting on the pendant around her neck. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice low but fierce. "This isn't just land. It's alive. And it will fight back against anyone who disrespects it." As if in response, a sudden gust of wind swept through the grove, rattling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. The workers paused, looking uneasy, but Ignacio barked at them to continue. "This isn't over," Estella said, her eyes blazing. "You've been warned. The grove fights back." That night, as Ignacio's workers set up lights and machinery to work through the darkness, the land began to stir. The grove, which had been peaceful since its restoration, seemed to awaken with a new, protective energy. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. The ground beneath the workers' feet began to tremble, small cracks forming in the dry earth. Machines sputtered and stalled, their engines failing one by one. Ignacio stood in the center of the chaos, shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the rising sound of the wind. One of the workers dropped his tools and fled, followed by another and then another. By morning, the site was deserted. The machinery lay abandoned, and Ignacio was nowhere to be found. Estella, Lupita, and Javier arrived at the grove to find the villagers gathered there, their faces a mix of awe and relief. "What happened?" Lupita asked, her voice hushed. "The land protected itself," Dona Rosa said simply, her eyes shining with quiet wonder. Estella knelt by the monolith, placing her hand on its cool surface. The carvings glowed faintly, their light steady and reassuring. She felt a deep sense of connection, as though the land was thanking her for keeping the promise alive. A legacy preserved. In the days that followed, Ignacio's efforts to claim the land fell apart. The community's legal filings, combined with the eerie events at the grove, made him abandon his plans entirely. The land was officially designated as protected, its sacred status recognized by both the community and the authorities. Estella, Lupita, and Javier stood together at the sanctuary one evening, the soft glow of the pool reflecting in their eyes. "We did it," Lupita said, her voice quiet but triumphant. "We protected the promise." Estella smiled, her hand resting on the pendant. "We didn't just protect it. We restored it. And now, it's up to all of us to ensure it stays this way." Javier nodded. "The promise isn't just about the land. It's about the people who care for it. As long as we remember that, it will never be broken." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sanctuary seemed to hum with approval, its light blending with the stars above. Estella felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the promise was alive, stronger than ever. And as she stood there, surrounded by the land and the people she had come to love, she knew that her father's legacy, and the legacy of the sanctuary, would endure for generations to come.